while I'm getting things set up here. So yeah, I know Derek because we're in the master's program together, and I've been a Christian for 43, next month 44 years. Married 30 years ago, got 3 adult kids in their 30s, and we somehow landed in San Diego about, I don't know, 22 years ago or so. I was a professor of chemistry and physics for about 34 years. I was back in the ministry back a zillion years ago, back in San Diego in the 80s, and I was one of the leading figures in the movement of getting fired. I got fired from the ministry because I wasn't very good at it at the time, honestly. So went back into teaching, and then so we, obviously started a teaching ministry there. And my wife and I, we worked shepherding singles in San Diego for many years, for about 12 years. And with God's help, we took a group of kind of barely together, about maybe 25, and it grew to around 80 or so. So that was a really cool ministry. But at the age of 63, I decided to retire early. I had felt for a long time that as we get into our empty nester years and our retirement years, that's when we should take it to the next level in our ministry. I've been saying that for a long time. So I thought, well, you know what, maybe I ought to do that. So I did. Actually, Paul kind of, he kind of pushed me a little bit in that direction, a member of your church there. But anyway, so I was planning on teaching and writing and doing podcasts and traveling, but somehow it came up the opportunity, the need for a leader in Bakersfield. So my wife and I moved to Bakersfield. We led the church there. That was not on my list of things to do at all, not even slightly, but that's what we did for 3.5 years. And we felt like our churches needed a boost of just faith that God could really do great things again. And the church grew quite a bit. But then we felt like we needed to plant a church in California. There hadn't been a church planted in California for almost 25 years. It's embarrassing to admit, but true. So I decided to form a consortium, and we put it together. And then it came time to figure out who's going to lead this thing. And well, it was like, here am I, send me, Isaiah 6 moments. So we moved to Merced. I'm 67. My wife is roughly around that age, but I don't say exactly. And here we are. I'm doing campus ministry. I'm on campus all the time, sharing my faith. I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest campus minister in our movement here. And so we're starting a church from scratch. That's kind of what we're doing. All right. So it's the great adventure, right? Anyway, my voice is not that great. I've got a sort of a bad cold. Hopefully it'll hold out. So our topic tonight, the first 2 weeks of the 3-week series are fairly basic stuff, honestly. For those of you who've been around for a while, there may even be a lot of this information you already know. Next week will be a little bit more of a challenging topic on progressive theology and where that kind of fits in with where our churches are headed. A little bit more advanced topic. So this one would be great for teens and all that. Next week, it might be good for them, or they might be confused by it. I don't know. We'll see. So anyway, I'm going to talk about the reasons I believe that we can trust the Bible. All right. Oops. Uh-oh. There we go. So 2-part outline. Number 1, because I believe the original writings of the Bible are inspired by God. And number 2, because I believe the original writings that were inspired by God have been faithfully transmitted to us. And if the original writings were inspired and those original writings are faithfully relayed to us, then we can certainly trust it almost by definition. So, all right, so here's some passages, familiar passage. 2 Timothy 3:16, which says all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for correcting, rebuking, and training in righteousness, so the person of God may be thoroughly equipped. Great claim, but why would we believe that? I mean, I've had people try to use that to prove the Bible's inspired by God, but I'm telling you, that verse does not prove the Bible's inspired by God, obviously. It's just a statement. Or there's 1 Thessalonians 2:13, where Paul says, I'm thankful you received the word for what it is, the word of God. But how do we know it's true? How do we know it's inspired? Well, there's a little bit of a hint in 2 Peter 1:19 through 21, where Peter says, we have the prophetic word made more certain. And why was it that the apostles had the prophetic word made more certain? It's because of what they saw. And specifically, they saw the prophecies fulfilled. So how can we, who have the Old Testament and the New Testament in our hands, how can we be more certain of the inspiration of the Bible? I want to talk about that. Well, let me give you a few reasons. First of all, there's Micah 5, verse 2. And if we read Micah 5, verse 2, we're going to be zipping through these passages. Hopefully you can keep up that or take notes. The PowerPoint will be at my website. I forgot to get my recorder, Derek. So are you recording this? All right, good. Maybe you can send me the recording. Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you're small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. This is a messianic prophecy. By the way, did you know that there were two Bethlehems in Israel? The smaller of the two was Bethlehem Ephrathah. Just so happens that Jesus was born in the right city. But actually, being born in the right city wasn't enough, because then there's Isaiah 9, 1 through 2. We'll go there. Isaiah 9, 1 through 2. It says, nevertheless, there'll be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. Now, if all you read was verse 1 and 2, you might think, oh, what's that talking about? Zebulun and Naphtali and Galilee, what's that about? Well, if you skip down to verse 6, you'll see what he's talking about. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So the prophecy is that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but would come from the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Where's that? Well, here's a map. It's a map. Maybe some of these have these in the back of your Bible. Zebulun is the blue one with the arrow, and Naphtali is the orange one. So you see where the border between Zebulun and Naphtali is? Now let's look at our next little slide. See where Nazareth is. Okay. Nazareth is right on the border of Zebulun and Naphtali. So in order to be the Messiah, you have to be born in Bethlehem, but then you have to come from the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. In fact, if you look a little bit closer, you'll see in Isaiah 11:1 that the Messiah would be called a Nazarene, a branch. Did you know that the word Nazar, branch, it means branch? And so Jesus literally was born in Branchville, essentially. So the Messiah had to come from the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, from a place called Nazar. All right, so how many people that are alive today do you think were born in Bethlehem, but actually come from the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, kind of near this little town known as Nazareth? But that's not all, because in order to be the Messiah, somebody had to be despised and rejected. And also they had to not open their mouth when they were accused, and they also had to be pierced. And a few other things in there in Isaiah 53, like they have to come from a grave, from a rich person's grave. And also, if you want to claim to be the Messiah, you got to deal with Isaiah 7, verse 14. Pretty famous one. Excuse me. Hanging in there. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him God with us. The Messiah, God with us, would be born of a virgin. And, by the time I've gone through this many prophecies, and I look at the story of Jesus, I find myself saying, if you don't believe the Bible is inspired by God at this point, I don't know, what planet are you living on? Where's your brain making connections? This is just a little bit too much to think could be just an accident. But then I go to Psalm 22. I read a pretty cool psalm. And by the way, all but one of the psalms we're reading, all but one of the passages we're reading, were considered by the Jews themselves to be messianic ones. The only one that we're reading that was not considered by the Jews before Jesus to be messianic is Psalm 22. But let's read it. Starting in verse 16, dogs have surrounded me, a pack of villains encircles me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Now, this is a psalm of David written maybe around 1980 BC. And did you know that crucifixion wasn't even invented until roughly 300 BC by the Persians? But they didn't pierce hands and feet. It was the Romans who did that, starting somewhere around 100 BC. So I like to imagine David writing this down. He writes down, they have pierced my hands and my feet. And then he must have said to himself, why did I say that? I don't know. But notice it also says, they divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Now, can you imagine? Because Jesus said in Luke 24:44, all the prophecies written about me, I need to fulfill them. So can you imagine him up on the cross saying, hey guys, my clothing there, I know you're dividing the garments amongst you, but that inner garment, that's really valuable. So can I make a suggestion? Why don't you gamble over that inner garment? Because you need to fulfill the prophecy in what they're later going to call Psalm 22:18, because you have to divide my garments, but actually cast lots for my clothing. Of course, that's a ridiculous idea. And so how does somebody who does not believe in the Bible, how about somebody who doubts the inspiration of the Bible, how can they possibly deal with this obvious mark of inspiration? Now, I'm going to tell you something. I cannot prove to you that Esther chapter 4, verse 7 is inspired by God. I can't do it. I have no specific evidence for Esther 4, verse 7. By the way, I just pulled that out of the hat. I have no idea what it says. But the fact is, the marks of inspiration are found all over the Old and the New Testament. Well, let's go on. There's a few more interesting ones. All right. How about Zechariah 9, verse 9? We all know that one. Behold, the king rides in on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, Jesus could have sort of arranged that one to be fulfilled by, he did actually arrange for the donkey to be prepared. But what about Zechariah 11, 12 and 13? Zechariah 11, 12 and 13. Thing is, when we look at this, we're creating a cumulative case. So those who don't believe the Bible is inspired by God, they have a stake in proving that this is all made up stuff. So what they'll do is they'll try to take one verse at a time, separate it from all the others, and give a reason to believe this is not really a prophecy about Jesus. For example, in looking at Psalm 22, the one that says pierced, they'll tell you that Hebrew word can also mean camel. All right, so they've cameled my hands and my feet. All right, that's not a very good defense against the idea that that was a prophecy of the Messiah. Or they'd go to Isaiah 7 or Isaiah 9 and point out that that prophecy could have applied to the Messiah, but it also could have applied to Hezekiah, which is true, by the way, but nevertheless, it's a messianic prophecy. All right, Zechariah 11, 12 and 13. All right, pray for my voice to hold up for about 15 more minutes, 20 more minutes here. Zechariah 11, 12 and 13. It says, I told them, I think if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter, to the house of the Lord. In this conversation, this is God speaking. He says, the handsome price at which they priced me. This is certainly a messianic prophecy. So anyway, I'm curious, how much did they give Judas in order to betray Jesus? Oh, that's right, 30 pieces of silver. I would have liked to have been there when one of those Pharisees or teachers of the law, they're, reading the Old Testament, a few months later, they opened up to Zechariah 11. Of course, I don't know if they called it chapter 11, whatever. They open up to this passage and they go, man, should have given him 100 pieces of silver. And by the way, not only did they give him 100 pieces of silver, as you probably know, Judas had a moment of remorse, I guess. So he tried to throw the money back into the temple. They refused to take it. Instead, they took that money and they bought a potter's field. At this point, I don't know how we can reject the idea that the Bible is inspired by God. Now, I'm going to make a little comment here because all of us have doubts, right? All of us have stuff we hear on the internet. What about this? What about that? You know what? I try to remind myself, well, I don't know about that. When I think about the messianic prophecies, one thing is settled. All right, there may be issues to think about, but one thing I know is God inspired the Old Testament. That is a done deal. That issue ended in my life about 44 years ago. Let me see. I think I have another one here. Oh, yeah, we could do Daniel 9. That's sort of cool. Daniel 9. Maybe. We'll see. 77s, Daniel 9:24, decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in the everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. No one understand this from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and the anointed one, the ruler comes, there'll be 7 sevens, 62 sevens, etc. And there was a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. It's actually in Ezra chapter 6. It was given in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, which is the year 458 BC. And if you subtract 490 from 458, you get the answer negative 32. And by the way, 490 because 70 times 7. And let me see, that would be 32 AD, except no, because there was no year 0. So we have a prophecy here, this same Messiah who would ride into Jerusalem on a colt full of a donkey, who would be pierced in hands and feet, would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, born in Bethlehem, come from Nazareth, etc. The same one, he would come to Jerusalem specifically to seal a vision and prophecy and to be anointed as the Messiah in the year roughly 33 AD. All right, there's some other details in that passage I won't get into, but that's sort of cool to me. So if anybody wants to claim to be the Messiah at this point, they got a problem. Because first of all, they have to get born out of a virgin. That's a pretty tough thing to pull off, but they have to do it in Bethlehem. And they have to come from Galilee, somewhere on the border between Zebulun and Naphtali. In fact, more specifically, in the town of Nazareth. They have to be despised and rejected, meek and silent when accused, pierced and crucified, by the way. Have their garments divided, be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, etc. Now, again, I get to the end of this list and I say, all right, I surrender. And this is not even beginning to look at the other evidence for the inspiration of the Bible. In Matthew 5:17, where Jesus says, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And Jesus fulfills the law and prophets in an almost infinite number of ways. Certainly through fulfilling messianic prophecies. But then if we were to talk about types, prefigures, and foreshadows that go on and on, the list is unending. Get a copy of my book, From Shadow to Reality. At some point, you kind of got a pretty solid case here. And besides, what about the other evidence? What about the fact, and in Acts 2:22, when Peter said, Jesus worked signs, wonders, and miracles, as everybody here knows, there was no voice saying, really? Never heard about that. That Jesus worked signs, wonders, and miracles, unique in all history, is virtually a historical fact. And what about the resurrection? Let's talk about that. There's a few things I'm sure of. I'm sure that I exist. Sure, my wife is faithful to me. I'm sure the Bible is inspired by God. And I'm sure that Jesus was raised from the dead. That's the whole 15-minute other thing that I don't have time to do. I'm just going to list off the facts. Empty tomb, crucifixion, resurrection proclaimed, 500 eyewitnesses. I demand anybody to provide any explanation of the facts of the empty tomb, the crucifixion, the proclamation of the resurrection in Jerusalem, and the 500 eyewitnesses, other than the simple fact, and honestly hard to believe fact, that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead. Again, stuff comes up. What about this issue? What about this progressive theology thing? What about that? Oh, I don't know, but Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, what about the church, and how about the leadership issues? How about that one contradiction, in, I don't know, Luke 5, and how about this one verse that we're not sure if it's even supposed to be in there? I don't know. Jesus was raised from the dead. I don't know. It kind of gives a little bit of clarity when I think about the empty tomb. Now, I said I had two parts to my talk, and I only have 30 minutes, so I got to break all kinds of records, but I'm sort of practically on schedule, because next I want to talk about why I believe that what we have, that not only was the original inspired, but what we have admittedly in translated form is a very, very precise reflection of what was originally written, the inspired original. All right, so there's way too much information on the screen right here, but I point out that there's some really famous ancient documents there, such as the writings of the great historian Herodotus, of whom we have only 8 manuscripts in existence in Greek. And the oldest one we have is 1,350 years after Herodotus died. What about Aristotle? Nobody ever questions the reliability of what Aristotle wrote, his book Physics and all these other things. We only have 5 manuscripts, ancient manuscripts in Greek of Aristotle, and our oldest ones come from 1,450 years after Aristotle died. And we could go on. And then people say, oh, you can't trust the New Testament. Our Muslim friends say that it's been, changed, and Constantine, everybody knows that Constantine changed the New Testament. He made it as if Jesus was a God, and all this. I almost said a bad word. Can you say CRAP? Can you say that? You can't say that. All that stuff. We'll just say all that stuff. All right. But then we look at the manuscript evidence for the New Testament, and whereas there are only 8 surviving manuscripts of Herodotus and only 5 remaining ancient manuscripts of Aristotle, all of them well over 1,000 years older than the original, with the New Testament, we have more than 8,000 ancient manuscripts. And the oldest of them is only 50 years after the original. In fact, the most reliable ancient document by a factor of 100 more than any other is the New Testament. And anybody who tells you you can't trust our Greek text of the New Testament either doesn't know what they're talking about or they're lying. Those that are, or possibly grossly being nice about it, grossly exaggerating. I think we could say that. So let's look at some of those manuscripts. By the way, I've been to the Rylands Museum. It's in Manchester, and I go to Manchester, and I went to the stadium, Manchester United Stadium. That's cool. But then I went to the Rylands Museum, where you have the Rylands Papyrus, 125 AD, plus or minus 25 years. I mean, the original of John was practically warm when this one was copied. That's impressive. Now, it's just a fragment. It's just a fragment. Then we have in the Sackler Library, which is in Cambridge University, we have a piece of John from 150 AD. And then the Magdalen manuscripts. All right, that's in the Magdalen Library. And they have pieces of Matthew from 175 AD. And I've been to the Chester Beatty Museum. It's in Dublin in Ireland. And there's rooms full of these things. I'm like a kid in a candy shop when I go to the Chester Beatty Museum. And here there are dozens of manuscripts from the late first century until the late second century until the early fourth century. The Bodmer Papyrus, etc. And then we have entire Greek New Testaments. We have Codex Sinaiticus from about 325, 350 AD. And by the way, I was in the British Museum and I took that picture. And then the guy told me, hey, what are you doing there? Too late. It was already in my camera. So there we go. All right. And so we have entire New Testaments. And the funny thing is, people say that, Constantine, whose reign was in like 310 to 330 AD, that he changed the New Testament. First of all, really? Do you really think the church would let Constantine change their Bible? Seriously? And besides, we have dozens and dozens of manuscripts that are older than that. So that idea is really quite ridiculous. And then we have the church father quotes. We have Clement of Rome, who wrote somewhere around either 95 or 96 AD. He wrote this letter about the same time that the book of Revelation was written. That's how old this is. And he quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter. We have Ignatius, a bishop, who quoted from, you can see there the list, Matthew, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. He quotes from over half the New Testament books. We have Polycarp, 120 AD. Again, quoted from over half the New Testament books. And then Irenaeus, near the end of the 2nd century, he listed all 27 books in the New Testament, and he quoted from all 27 of them. In fact, it's been claimed, and I checked it out because I was, people say all kinds of stuff. It's been claimed that you can reproduce almost the entire New Testament just from quotes from the New Testament in the first 4 centuries after Christ. And it's true. I actually checked it out. Some crazy person did that study. And so the bottom line is the evidence that we have for the accuracy of our New Testament is ridiculous. And by the way, people say, well, what about the other gospels? What about the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary? What about those? None of these church fathers ever quoted from any of those, except Irenaeus, who quoted from the Gospel of Thomas to show why it was bogus. So the idea that there were competing gospels is nonsense. Even the Gnostics did not quote authoritatively from their own writings, which is interesting. So what about Constantine changing the Bible? What about all those copying errors? What about Mark 16, 9-20, or John 5, 3-4? What about those? Well, here's my conclusion, and I could back it up with more discussion if you have questions. But I believe the Greek New Testament that we have at our disposal is somewhere between either 99 and 99.9% certain. In other words, somewhere around 0.3% of the words of the New Testament, there is some doubt about that. And those doubts involve things that do not affect any important teaching in the New Testament. All right. And we could talk about the Old Testament. By the way, the Old Testament is not 99.7% accurate. It's less than that because it's an older document and it had been copied for a very long time. Luckily, we have a lot of manuscript evidence for the Old Testament as well. There's the Masoretic text from about 800 AD. And there's the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's the Septuagint. I'll talk about that briefly here. Before 1940, the oldest Old Testament manuscripts we had were from roughly 900 AD. The problem with that is that's a pretty long time. The original writings, let's say 500 BC, and the oldest manuscript, 900 AD, that would be a similar span to that of, say, Plato or Aristotle or Herodotus. And the fact is, a fair amount of change could have happened in the copying process over 1400 years. All right, there's that annoying 1400 years. But then, probably most of you are aware, in 1947, a young Arab child threw a rock into a cave. Instead of hitting other rocks, it hit pottery. Crawled down in there. He made the first discovery of what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's cave number 4. They've found manuscripts of every single Old Testament book except Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They found entire manuscripts, for example, of Isaiah from about 150 BC. Some of the Old Testament of the Dead Sea Scrolls are as much as even 250 before Christ. So what this does, there you go. There's some of the data. I won't get into that, but I like this little graph here. So before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the time difference was 1400 years between the oldest one being published and the newest one being discovered. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, that time frame went from 1400 years down to around 300 years. And so we covered over three quarters of the time span. And the changes in the Dead Sea Scroll Isaiah from the Masoretic scroll Isaiah was minuscule, only a few words. So my conclusion is, yes, undoubtedly, the original writings of both the Old and New Testament are absolutely inspired by God. Like I said, I cannot prove through data every single verse is inspired. But what I'm going to show is large parts are certainly inspired. In fact, if you think they're not, I ask you to please rethink your thinking. And it goes beyond the messianic prophecies. There's scientific evidence. I wish I had time to talk about the historical evidence, all these things. I'd say there is no reasonable doubt that the Bible is inspired by God. And number 2, given the evidence from the manuscripts and the canonization of the Old and New Testament, that we have a virtually perfect copy of the original Greek and Hebrew. We could talk next about translation, about some of those copying errors and all those things. But I think I already went, my full 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing, and we can take as many questions as you want. I've got nothing else going tonight, so we can go as long as you want. Are the Astros playing tonight? Oh, are you all DVRing it or what?
I don't know what they're all doing. Hopefully they're not sinning.
Yeah, hopefully not. That was not a bad game last night. I rooting for them.
So I do have a couple questions here for you real quick.
Great.
What would be the most popular argument against the validity of the Bible? Or what would be a popular argument that people would hear about the inspiration of the Bible against it?
Well, oh my goodness, they'll say it's full of contradictions, for example. All right, and if you go to my website, there's a whole section in there in the Q&A section about supposed contradictions. Here's the thing. As far as I know, there are no bona fide contradictions. And the vast majority of claimed contradictions are so obviously not, it's like almost a joke. But there's a small fraction that, that's actually a good question. But all these supposed contradictions are fairly easily worked out. For example, they'll say, for example, Matthew says, it says in the Old Testament, they will call him a Nazarene. And they'll say, that's not in the Old Testament. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that it says that Jesus will come from Nazareth. And yet it's because they don't know what they're talking about. Because there's Isaiah 11:1, which calls the Messiah branch. And branch is Nazar. So these claims of contradiction are due to either just false information or shallow understanding of the scriptures. Another example would be Hosea 11:1, where where Matthew quotes Hosea, Hosea, I think it's 6 verse 1, out of Egypt I call my son. And they'll say that's totally taken out of context, because that's a reference to Israel coming out of Egypt. But if you understand type and foreshadow in the Old Testament, out of Egypt I called my son applies to his son Joseph. It applies to his son Moses. It applies to Israel. It also applies to Jesus, who was called out of Egypt, and also applies to us who are called out of Egypt. So one of the fossil sort of attacks on the inspiration of the Bible is through claims about contradiction, but it's simply not true. Another attack is from all the historical errors in the Bible. And my response to that is, okay, give me one, please. Give me one. Give me one statement in the Bible, a statement of fact that is contradicted by any historical or archaeological discovery. And what you'll find is there are none. And then also they'll attack it from the perspective, not that the original was inspired, but that it's been translated and transmitted and changed over time. The bottom line is the arguments against the inspiration of the Bible basically generally are the counter arguments against the evidence for the inspiration of the Bible. So they'll try to cut it down. And generally the opponents of the Bible, what they want to do is they don't want you to look at the big picture. They want to choose one particular thing and make one particular point out of the context of the entire question. So that's a big question. Excuse me, it's almost too big for me to answer in a simple form.
Sure. Kind of along with that, what would be the most historical find, in your opinion, that in a sense?
All right, well, I got a whole other PowerPoint on that one.
Is there one that sticks out in your mind?
How about the fact that they found the city of Sodom and that it was indeed destroyed by fire in roughly 2000 BC? That's fairly significant. How about the Tel Dan inscription, which was found in the city of Dan in northern Israel, which lists the house of Omri, and it lists King Jehu. It also mentions the house of David and his descendants. One of my favorites was found in the Ziggurat in Ur. That's an interesting one because in Daniel 5, it mentions the writing on the wall, and the last king of Babylon is Belshazzar. And the critics of the Old Testament, the critics of the Bible said, no, that's not true. The last king of Babylon was Nabonidus. All the records said the last king of Babylon was Nabonidus. They all were in agreement. That's what the Greek and the Latin writers, they were unanimous. And so, and Herodotus as well. So they'd say, there's just, another example, just one more example of how the Bible is just made up stories. But then in the Ziggurat in Ur, they found an inscription that explained what happened. Nabonidus did a palace coup. He took the throne, but he was not legitimate. He was not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But what he did was he married the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So therefore his grandson, whose name was Belshazzar, by the way, was legitimate heir to the throne. And what he did was he made him his regent king. And Nabonidus was largely an absent king. So Belshazzar ruled for something like 17 years as regent king until he was killed on the very night that the writing was written on the wall. What's really cool about that is Belshazzar says to Daniel, if you're going to interpret the writing on the wall, I'll give you the third place in the kingdom. So why the third place? Why not the second place? Such historical details, right? Well, the reason is because Belshazzar occupied the second place in the kingdom. So you have number one, archaeology proves the Bible is right and the other ancient historians were wrong. And number two, it has this little detail that nobody could have put in there ahead of time. They wouldn't even have thought about that, which only makes sense when later on the actual historical facts are revealed. There's a lot more stuff like that.
Okay. Another question is, what is the purpose of multiple translation in English, NIV, NLT, GNT? How can we trust the accuracy of translation?
Yeah, that's a
How-
great
How can we
question.
answer someone outside the church who questions the Bible's accuracy due to multiple translations?
By the way, can I tell you a secret little fact that might make you slightly uncomfortable for the first 30 seconds? Did you know that almost none of the words in the New Testament are the actual words of Jesus? You know why? Because Jesus spoke in Aramaic. He didn't speak in Greek. So the very words we have in the New Testament are a translation. Now there's Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and and Korban and stuff like that. So just a little fact throw out there in case you never thought about that. And so again, so what we have is in the New Testament, what we have in the Gospels is a faithful, reliable rendition of what was originally said by Jesus. All right, and so we have translations, and having multiple translations really helps. For example, let's say here's where a Greek word, here's the meaning of a Greek word. Well, here's an English word, not quite the same meaning, but you have to use an English word. Well, here's another English word over here. It's got a different meaning. And if you have several translations, then you can see the different meanings. And that's why the best translation of the Bible, especially the New Testament, is 3 or 4 different translations. Because if you read them all, you kind of get a sense of all the translations, kind of take a ballpark average of the meanings of the translations, and it gives you really, really good information about the original meaning. I'm going to make a crazy statement. I believe we have so much knowledge available to us in the 21st century of ancient Hebrew history, ancient Greek history, knowledge of the Roman world, the Babylonian world, the Greek, the Koine Greek, the ancient Hebrew, that we have as much ability to understand what Paul said to the church in Corinth as the Corinthians did. Sure, they may have had a little bit more subtle understanding of some of the idioms he used, but we have all this other information that even the Corinthians didn't have. So I believe that not only do we have a very precise New Testament, but with all the devices we have for looking at how the languages are translated and all the scholars and all that sort of stuff, I believe a group of 3 or 4 good translations in English provides as useful insight into the original thing that Paul said in Corinth or Jesus said there and the Sermon on the Mount as the original people that were there in the room and at that place had. Now, that might be an overstatement, but that's what I believe is the case. Because honestly, we know more than the audience did if you're willing to do all the work to look it up. So that's why we have several translations. And by the way, there's 3 kinds of translations. There's word for word, NAS, RSV, ESV. Those are technically the most precise translations. Then there's phrase for phrase, like the NIV, which is arguably not quite as precise, but it does a better job of giving maybe the sense of what was being said. Then we have paraphrases, like the New Living Translation and those things. And there, again, there's nothing wrong with any of those. Honestly, sometimes phrase for phrase is easier to get what the person's saying. So again, I would say if you want to have the most precise insight into what was originally said, you do not need to become an expert in Hebrew or Greek. You just need several good translations at your hand, and you're good to go.
What's your top 2 favorite?
My top 2 are Holman Christian Standard. The reason I like that one is because it's one of the few that they purposely, this is their philosophy. Their philosophy is We do word for word when that gives a better sense, but we're willing to use phrase for phrase if that gives a better sense of the original. So I like their philosophy. My second one, I know it's boring and you're not supposed to say this because if you're a scholar, you're never supposed to ever admit this. I like the NIV. The reason is it's probably the most readable of them. And, you know, the large parts of the New Testament were meant to be read. I'm sorry, were meant to be read out loud. See what I'm saying? So I know my fellow teachers would probably turn their lip at me for saying the NIV. You know, yeah, I'm not scholarly enough, but I don't care what they think. I like the NIV.
I prefer the Message. I'm just teasing.
I was trying to decide if that. By the way, honestly, if you're just going to read the Bible like a novel, the Message is probably it might be the best one to read, or one of those paraphrases. But when you're reading a paraphrase, just remember you're kind of reading a novel, and just bear that in mind. All right. But to get the feeling for the flavor of what's going on, reading the Bible sort of quickly as one thing that you do to approach the Bible is actually a good idea. So I don't have a problem with paraphrases as long as you also have one of those more precise ones. And when in doubt, I pull my Greek English interlinear out. When in doubt, I pull out my my comprehensive concordance out, and I'll look up all the different ways that the Greek word is translated, and we got all that stuff. I'm telling you, we have so many tools that honestly, I'm joking here. I'm joking, but I don't know why people bother to learn Greek and Hebrew anymore. I'm sort of joking, but I'm not completely joking.
All right, one last question we got. What is one thing that you still find yourself having to work through, kind of in your mind and in your beliefs of your belief of God, or is there something?
There are a few things. Yeah, there are a few things, and they're theological. They're not doctrinal. They're not things like, can I trust the Bible? They're theological things, like, for example, heaven. I don't understand heaven sometimes because to me, joy without suffering doesn't really make sense. Joy only exists in light of suffering. So what's heaven going to be like? I mean, on the one hand, it says no more tears. Oh, wait, that's the song we sing. But actually in the Bible, it says he'll wipe away every tear. And then the idea of judgment, I kind of ponder when I'm in heaven, how am I going to feel about the fact that my grandmother's in hell? How am I going to feel about that? And I wonder about that. And I look at places in like Revelation, I can't remember, I think it's 11, where they say how long, and even David in those imprecatory Psalms, what he's saying, God, come and just take those people out, kind of stuff. And so the idea of hell, intellectually, I get it. I don't struggle with it intellectually, but emotionally, and so there are debates even amongst faithful, believing Christians that I know in our church. Hell is real, but whether it's an eternal suffering or it's a suffering for time and then there's annihilation, that whole theory that Doug Jacoby strongly supports, I don't know what I think about that one. So yeah, the idea of intellectually, I can say, hey, God doesn't send anybody to hell. We choose to go there, and he very, very sadly, with great sorrow, accepts our decision. All right, sounds great on paper. When I think about hell, it bothers me. I'm being real with you.
Sure.
There are some minor points of doctrine I'm still batting around a little bit, but they're all minor ones. The major stuff is it's not a problem for me.
Is there anything that causes you to doubt the reality of God? And then if there is anything that does, do you go to anything to kind of bring yourself back, kind of like
I have doubts all the time. All of us have doubts. I mean, anybody who doesn't have doubt that's kind of weird. How could you not doubt? I mean, so I can remember when I was a young Christian, I used to think I wouldn't want to be cremated. I mean, if they cremate me, how's that going to work? Stuff like that. So do I ever find myself thinking, all right, I'm praying, right? Do I ever find myself thinking, am I praying to the top of my head, or what am I doing here? I mean, thoughts like that enter my head. Of course they do. And, and I'm a very, my training, as I'm a scientist, right? And I am trained, I'm a professional skeptic. I'm not a professional cynic, but I am a professional skeptic. And so when I hear people's crazy arguments, I am impelled to consider them. But see, the thing is, Derek, when I fall back on those few things, and that's what I said earlier tonight. I mean, there are facts. Oh, let me give an example. Let's say somebody came up to you and said, hey, I saw your wife having lunch with this sort of handsome looking guy. She was kind of looking around, like almost like she didn't want anybody to see her. What do you think about that? All right, so there we go. Let's say that happened. Now, would I question that my wife is faithful to me? Absolutely not. I don't care what the information is. I have enough information to know that whatever's going on, I'm telling you, that's not what's going on. There's no way. There is no way under God's earth that my wife would be unfaithful to me. All right. Because it can't defeat the evidence over time. So that's similar to me, because like I said, the fact that Jesus fulfilled those messianic prophecies is as solid as Stone Mountain in Atlanta. The fact that Jesus worked miracles, the fact that he was raised from the dead, the fact that the universe itself was created, as I talked about last week, or that life was created. These are things that are irrefutable. They're beyond any need to defend anymore in my mind. So I just go back there. Like I said, stuff comes up. I say, I don't know, but Jesus raised from the dead. So what about the the such and such theory? Did you hear the latest thing? Did you hear they discovered this new thing that raises questions about the genetics of blah blah blah? And I say, well, I don't know. Yeah, let me check into that. And what I find is, when I open myself up to the skeptics' criticisms, it always increases my faith. Always. Because they're wrong all the time. When you go into sort of presuppositional arguments with people, or worldview arguments with people, being right puts you in a good footing. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.